Hi everyone! We are back with a new video on our channel. Thank you so much for watching. So today I wanted to do a video showing you fantasy books I love, but it's kind of more of a fantasy recommendations video for those of you who love fantasy and you're looking to branch out into like some more fantasy books or series, but you're not sure like where else to turn to, or even if you're new to fantasy, I have some great recommendations for you. Let's get started. So the first series I'm going to recommend to you, you guys have probably heard of this author. Her name is Robin Hobb. She's written so many fantasy series and she's so popular. But today I'm going to recommend to you the Farseer trilogy from her. It consists of just like 3 books. It's a trilogy. It's in her series called The Realm of the Elderlings, which is like a really long series from her. And each part of the series, there's like 5 different. I think there's 5 different like trilogies within the whole universe from her. But I'm only recommended the Farseer trilogy because this is all I've read from her so far. And so the first book is called Assassin's Apprentice, and guys, I read this series like 4 years ago in quarantine, and I just like really enjoyed it. Like I thought the series was really good. I'm not gonna go into too much detail about these books either, because I don't want this video to be too long. But basically, this book is about a boy named Fitz who doesn't quite fit in this kingdom and like in this world. And I'm not gonna say anything else because I don't want to spoil you guys. But just know that this is such a great series. I feel like even if you're like a beginner to fantasy, I honestly think this would be a really great series for you because her writing style is pretty easy to read, and it's just like a really engaging, interesting series with like really great writing. And I love her books because they have such a classic old school fantasy like vibe to them. Especially this series, I get a strong like medieval type vibe with this series. So if you're a huge fan of like Tolkien or just like classic fantasy in general, usually about like a quest or just like royalty and like a messed up kingdom, I highly recommend the Farseer trilogy. And like I said, this is the first trilogy of hers to read, so if you want to start with any Robin Hobb, definitely start with this series like I did, because it is so good, and I think you guys will really like this series. It's just so good. And so yeah, I wanted to recommend the Farseer trilogy to you first, since that's one of them that I read like kind of recent and I loved. So yeah, if you haven't read Robin Hobb yet, you need to because her books are great. So the next one I'm going to recommend is another series I read in quarantine actually. This is a middle grade series and it is so like underrated. I never heard anyone talk about it. And so it is the Land of Stories series by Colfer. I'm holding up the first book, which is called The Wishing Spell, and oh my gosh, you guys, this series is so good. And I never heard anyone talk about this. Maybe because it's middle grade and like yeah, I know like most people don't read middle grade fantasy, at least not like right now because it's not very popular, but this series is so amazing. There's 6 books. It's a middle grade fantasy series about 2 siblings that are twins. Their names are Alex and Connor, and they both love fairy tales. And something happens, so they end up kind of getting transported into like this fairy tale world, and like I'm not gonna say anything else, but basically it's like they try to find. Actually, all I'm gonna tell you is this: they have to try to find their way out of the world and back into the real world. And while they're doing that, they have to go on tons of quests, and they have to try to like help all these fairy tale creatures and like save them and everything. And guys, the series is just so amazing. Like it's such like a comfort for me, like as someone who loves fairy tales so much, this series was such a joy to read because you literally get to see like every fairy tale creature ever in this series. If you guys are a huge fan of Disney and like Disney if you're a fan of Disney movies or like Disney princesses in general, pretty much all of those girls are in here. Like you would see so many like Disney fairy tale couples that are in this book. But yeah, pretty much every fairy tale creature you can think of is in here in this series. And it's just so cool to see like Alex and Connor, like it's so cool to see them really like interact with all these fairy tale creatures. And I really like the spin that like Chris really puts on these characters. It's just so fun. Like this is just like one of the funnest series I've ever read. So if you guys are like looking to venture into middle grade fantasy and you have not read this yet, or like if you love fairy tale retellings or fairy tale creatures in general, you need to read this series. It is so good. You will love it. That's everything else I'm gonna say about this series. You guys need to read it. This is the first book. It's called The Wishing Spell. Yes, I just love that series so much, and I want more people to read it because it's just amazing, and it's underrated and it needs more love. So yeah, let's move on to another middle grade fantasy series, which is this is actually like the series that got me into reading fantasy in like middle school. So the series I'm going to recommend to you, the series I'm talking about is the Frog Princess series by Evie Baker. This series is so special to me and it's so nostalgic because like I said, I started reading these books in middle school and they're just so good. I still go back to these books every several years because I just like love them so much. It's basically about the main character. Her name is Emma and she's a princess in a kingdom. And when the series starts out, she's around like 14, I think. And then and then in the later books, she's like 16, I think. So like, I guess you can say technically this is YA. But I think these books were always marketed as middle grade. I don't know why. But, so it's kind of like a spin off of The Frog Prince, except it's a cool twist because, so the frog, so the main character Emma, she kisses the frog, and you know how like he's supposed to turn back into a prince? Well, instead of that, Emma ends up getting turned into a frog, so the curse didn't work. And so her and the Frog Prince Edric, they end up going on this great journey together to try to reverse the curse. And it's just so good. I've read this whole series, and there's also a spin-off series to this too. And all the books are just so cute. Like it's just a really cute, simple fantasy fairy tale type series too, just like A Land of Stories. The romance in this series is so good too, considering this is supposed to be more like on the younger side of YA. Like Emma and Edric, they're literally like one of my favorite like fantasy book couples. I love them so much. And yeah, so yeah, if you're looking for another like fantasy series that's on the younger side but is also like kind of like high fantasy about like kingdoms and like a princess and a prince, you guys need to read the series. It is so underrated. I've never heard anyone talk about this ever on BookTube or anywhere else. It's so underrated and more people need to read the series because it is just so cute. And these books are just really, really quick reads. They're not too long either. So yeah, this is one of my all-time favorite series of all time, and I will recommend this series forever. So yeah, you guys need to read this series. It's just so good. So, next I'm going to move on to YA. I'm going to recommend to you next a series from one of my favorite authors of all time. Her name is Julie Kagawa. I've read so many of her series, but this one by far has to be my favorite, and it's like an old school It's kind of like an old school YA series that you've probably seen on BookTube maybe like 10 years ago, because it's very old. But I wouldn't recommend it anyway because it's one of my favorite series ever. And the series I'm talking about is the Iron Fae series from Julie Kagawa. This is one of my all-time favorite series. I love this series so much, and I feel like this series is what really got me into loving Fae. Because now, like, if I see a fantasy book out there that has Fae in it, I will automatically add it to my TBR and read it. That's how much I love Fae. But yeah, this is the series that really got me into, like, the Fae genre, like, that kind of, like, Fae trope, and even, like, love triangles, too. And it's basically about the main character, Megan. Her brother ends up getting kidnapped in the woods, and then so she goes looking for him, and then she gets trapped into this other world called the Never Never, and which is like it's like a typical like fantasy world where there's this like, fae and like different creatures, and so yeah, and then she ends up meeting she ends up meeting a fae prince named Ash, and yeah, it just goes from there, and yeah, this series is just so good. I can't really explain why I love this series so much, but I do. Like, I love all the characters. I love Megan so much. She's just such a great main character. And I love her best friend, Puck. He's awesome. I love him so much. And I love Ash, too. And this series also has a great romance. If you're looking for, like, a YA fantasy series that has a really good romance, and a romance that isn't toxic, I highly recommend this series because it is so good. I highly recommend it. If you haven't read it yet, you need to read it. Next I'm going to go into actually I'm going to stay with my YA recommendations, but I'm going to go into a couple paranormal series. They may not be considered fantasy 100%, but you know what? I'm going to include them in here anyway. Here's another OG series that was popular on YouTube like 10 years ago, and I'm gonna bring it back because I really want to see more people like read this series again. And the series I'm talking about is the Lux series from Jennifer Armentrout. Guys, this series is just really good. I feel like this was my gateway to Jennifer Armentrout like 10 years ago. I would say like it's one of her best series that I've ever read, but I basically just read another series from her that I'm going to talk about at the end of the video. But she's one of my favorite authors. I've read a lot of her books, but this series, the Lux series in particular, will always be one of my favorites. And it's just such a classic, nostalgic series about aliens, and the main character, she moves to this small town, and she ends up falling for an alien guy next door, whose name is Damon. And yeah, that's all I'm gonna say. It's really good. If you love paranormal romance, especially with aliens, I'm not even like an alien reader. Like, I never read alien romances, but I loved this series. Like, this whole series was so good, and like the romance is amazing. Jennifer Armentrout, she just like knows how to write like just really good romances. I always swoon over her guys too. She writes the best men. And okay, I would recommend this to anyone that likes like the Vampire Diaries, even though like this isn't vampires. This is not a vampire book, but I feel like it has a similar vibe and setting because she moves to a small town where there's like these paranormal creatures and there's like aliens, and you know, she falls for a guy that's like a supernatural creature. So yeah, even if you're a fan of Twilight too, I highly recommend this series. It's just really good. And it's just like one of my favorite series ever. And I think I would just love to see people like talk about this again, because this series was so popular like 10 years ago on BookTube. And I never hear anyone talk about it anymore, and I feel like I want to see this come back. So yeah, if you love Jennifer Armentrout, if you've read any of her like other books or even like her newer stuff, you should go back and read this series because it's just really good. Also, the main character, Katie, she's a book lover, so she's a great protagonist. So yeah, you should read the book series if you haven't yet. It's great. The next series I'm going to recommend is an underrated series that I haven't really heard people talk about on BookTube at all. These books are not that old. They came out a couple years ago, so I'm gonna talk about them anyway because I love them. And these are kind of like the Lux series where they're not like high fantasy, they're more paranormal, but I'm putting them in this video anyway because I didn't know like what to put them under. So the first book is Wicked Fox by Kat Cho. It's a duology, so the first book is called Wicked Fox, and then this is the second book. It's called Vicious Spirits. This one's actually it's kind of like a companion novel to Wicked Fox. So like this one follows one character from Wicked Fox. So you have to read Wicked Fox first in order to read Vicious Spirits. And so this book in particular means a lot to me because this is the book that got me into K-dramas. I kind of heard about K-dramas before this book, but like I didn't really know too much about them. But I remember when I was reading this book, I was reading the Goodreads reviews and someone really compared it to a K-drama. And so I was curious, so I like kind of looked up that K-drama that the person was referencing, and then it just like got me into the world of K-dramas. And I'm so grateful to that because of this book in particular. So, this book it's kind of like a paranormal romance. It's Korean. Kind of has a bit of Korean mythology in it. It's also YA. It kind of has a YA contemporary vibe to it because the main characters are in high school. But this series is unique because the female main character, she's a gumiho, which is basically like a nine-tailed fox. It's a thing in Korean mythology. So she's kind of like a paranormal creature. So it's basically a romance between her and this other guy. And yeah, it's just a really fun series. I don't read a lot of paranormal romance, but I really liked this book. I remember I had a hard time putting it down because it was just so engaging and just really fun. Like it reads like a K-drama. So like if any of you are K-drama fans, you need to read this series. It has a similar vibe. And yeah, if you guys like Asian books in general, I highly recommend this duology because it's just really good, and I haven't heard many people on BookTube talk about the series. Yeah. I wanted to recommend it because it's underrated. Okay, so now I'm gonna go back into some other YA. I'm sorry that most of my recommendations are YA, but to be fair, I haven't actually read too many adult fantasy series recently. So a lot of these are like older series that I love from years ago that I still want to recommend. So the next one I'm going to briefly go into is, let me grab it, is the Lunar Chronicles. This series exploded back on BookTube years ago, and it's just such a really great series for those of you that haven't read it. If you love fairy tale retellings, you need to read this series. For those of you that don't know the Lunar Chronicles, it's basically a fairy tale retelling series, but it's also sci-fi, which gives it like a really cool twist. Like this one's based on Cinderella, of course, because it's called Cinder, and she's a cyborg, which is like really unique. But it still has these classic fairy tale vibes, but all the female leads are really like strong and kick butt, and they're very tough, and they have to like deal with a lot and go on adventures and everything. It's a really fun series, and these books are so hard to put down. Like, oh my gosh, I really read this book like several times because I think Cinder is probably my favorite in the series, either this one or Cress, I would say. But yeah. And also, like, all these books have such amazing romances. Like, Marissa and Meyer did such a great job developing the romances for all the books. Like, she really makes you root for all the characters, and I really love this series in particular, it's very unique because all the characters from each book are in pretty much all of the books. Like, the characters from the first book are in the second book, and like it keeps going like that. And then all the characters are in the last book. It's really cool how like all the characters interact with each other. It's really unique, and they all try to kind of like defeat the evil like Queen Lavana. And I'm like, yeah, it's just like such a cool, fun, action-paced series with a great romance. So yeah, I love Cinder in particular. This is probably my favorite. I really, the second book, if you don't know, is Scarlet. This one was great too. This one is supposed to be like Red Riding Hood. And then the third one is Crest, which is one of my favorites too. This one's supposed to be like Rapunzel. And then the last one is Winter. And this one's Snow White. It's just such a great series. And this is another series in particular, just like the Lux series, where it was really popular back then on BookTube, and I would love to see it come back. Because it's such a great series, and I think the younger generation needs to read it. Okay, so let's move on to a couple more YA fantasy series I want to recommend to you. Now, this one has started coming back on Book Talk, I believe. You know, I haven't seen many people read it, but I think it is coming back. And it's one of my favorite, like, old, like, YA fantasy series. The series I'm talking about is The Remnant Chronicles by Pearson. So, yeah, this is one of my favorite fantasy series, too. It is so good. It's a trilogy. And it's a high fantasy series about our main character, Leah, who, in the beginning of the book, she is supposed to be in this arranged marriage with a prince that she never met. So she ends up running away because she doesn't want to marry him. And this book is really unique because it's in the point of views of like her, the prince, and like then there's an assassin who's after her to like kill her. So the point of views are her, the prince, and the assassin. But you don't know who the prince or who the assassin is. So you kind of have to figure that out as you read the book, and then it gets revealed. And this is another fantasy series I love because it has a great romance. So if you really love your high fantasy like I do with like the royalty, the prince, the princess, assassin, in a cool fantasy world, like you need to read this series in particular. I loved all the books. I think I gave all of them 5 stars. This one was amazing. I remember the second book, The Heart Betrayal, was just as good. I loved this one too. And then I remember the third one, The Beauty of Darkness. This one is like a very large book. It's very long. I remember flying through this book because I really could not put it down. But yeah, if you love like fantasy romance, high fantasy, you guys need to read The Remnant Chronicles. It is so good. The one you guys are seeing everyone talk about, I think, is Dance of Thieves. And a lot of people, I have not read that one yet. That's a spin-off series to this. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is you should read The Remnant Chronicles first before reading Dance of Thieves. But I know Dance of Thieves is like really popular on Book Talk right now. But you should read this series first. Because first of all, because it's amazing. But second of all, I think Dance of Thieves is supposed to be in the same world as this. But yeah, I highly recommend you to read this series first because it's amazing. And it's definitely it's still like one of my favorite like fantasy series like ever. And then I want to recommend to you an even more underrated fantasy series that I never hear anyone talk about. And you guys need to read this series, and the series I'm talking about is the Fallen Kingdom series. This is the first book. This was one of my favorite like YA fantasy series like years ago, and I still love it. Like just thinking about it makes me happy. It's just like a really fun, unique series. This series used to be always pitched as like the YA like Game of Thrones. So like if you're a Game of Thrones fan, you need to read this. Because that's what it's been compared to. I haven't read Game of Thrones. I haven't read any of those books. But people say it has a similar vibe. This is like a really cool high fantasy series, and it follows like 4 different point of views. Like one of the main characters is a princess, and then there's also a character who's a rebel and a sorceress, and then like an heir. It's kind of like Dance of Thieves, where it follows like multiple point of views. So if you're really into fantasy books that have multiple point of views, you need to read this. Also, like this series in particular too, it has a really good romance, but I will definitely tell you that I wouldn't call this like a fantasy romance in particular, because I feel like while this series does have romance, it's not the main focus of the series. I feel like the romance is more kind of on the back burner, or at least until like the second half of the series. And I think the second half of the series definitely had more romance in my opinion. So if you're gonna go into this series, don't go into it expecting like a lot of romance. It's definitely not romantasy. So yes, just know that going in. The first book is Fallen Kingdoms, of course. I will show them to you, and then second one is Rebel Spring. The third one is Gathering Darkness. The fourth book is Frozen Tides. The fifth one is Crystal Storm. And then the last book, which is probably one of my favorite books in the series, is Immortal Reign. So yeah, the Fallen Kingdom series is so good and so underrated. I want to see more people read it, so if you're a big fan of YA fantasy, you need to read that series because it is so good. Okay, so that's it for all the actual series I wanted to tell you about, or at least I wanted to focus more on the underrated series first, or older series that I want to bring back. So you have all of those recommendations. Those are for the people who are sick of seeing the same fantasy books be talked about on Book Talk. And so if you're looking for different books, different ones that aren't on Book Talk, definitely read any of these I previously mentioned. Now I'm going to go into a few honorable mentions because I feel like I have to include these. So let's do it. This one is probably the most underrated fantasy out of all the ones I own. It is called Kiss of the Royal by Lindsay Dugai. I'll tell you a little story about this one. One year when I worked at Barnes & Noble, I saw this one on the shelf and I thought the cover was really pretty, so I picked it up and I read the back of the book and it sounded really good, so I bought it and then I read it and I loved it. This is such an underrated fantasy book. It's actually a standalone. So if you like standalone fantasies, you need to read this. It's YA fantasy, and it's a typical high fantasy where the main character is a princess and she has to go on a quest with this guy. But one of the things I absolutely loved about this book that stuck out to me was the fact that it's very romantic. This book in particular has a great romance. But what's really different about it is the guy is actually the hopeless romantic one. The guy is the hopeless romantic, and the girl is the one who doesn't really like romance. So I thought that was a really cool twist on this book, and I loved Zach, and I loved how romantic he was, and this book just has a really cute, sweet romance. So if you want to read a good fantasy standalone with a great romance, I highly recommend this, and I wish more people heard about this book because this book is honestly a hidden gem. So yeah, you guys need to read this. So, I feel like it can't be a fantasy video if I didn't talk about Sarah J. Maas at least once. I was trying to veer away from recommending Sarah J. Maas because everybody knows who she is. She's one of the most hyped up authors ever. But I'm just gonna briefly say that I love her books. I've been reading her for a long time. I've been reading her books ever since the Throne of Glass and Avatar books first came out 10 years ago. So I'm a long OG fan of her books. The Throne of Glass series is one of my favorites of all time. Same with Avatar. So all I'm gonna say is if you're new to Sarah J. Maas, I recommend reading Throne of Glass first. in my personal opinion. This is the very first book I read from her in like 2013, and I fell in love. This was like one of the first books that got me into fantasy, so it's really special to me. So yeah, I had to throw some Sarah J. Maas in there, and if you're wondering about Crescent City, as of this video, I read the first Crescent City book and loved it. I need to continue the series. So yeah, I just wanted to throw a little bit of Sarah J. Maas in there for you. Here's another popular author. You guys probably all know this series, but I'll briefly mention it. But another favorite OG series of mine is The Infernal Devices. The series is just absolutely amazing. I feel like this is Cassandra Clare's best series. And so yeah, I will always love this series so much. And it has the best love triangle ever. So yeah, I just wanted to include this in there as an honorable mention too. And then there's another honorable mention. I'm just gonna throw in there. Fourth Wing. I love Fourth Wing. I'm only gonna mention it for a second because everybody already knows what this is. Have not read Iron Flame yet, and I still need to. And here's another underrated one. I love A Curse of Dark and Lonely by Bridget Kemmerer. This is actually a trilogy, but so I fell in love with the first book. The first book is really good. It's an amazing Beauty and the Beast retelling, and like it's just really unique because the main character has a disability that I could really relate to. Like she was such a great, strong female main character, and the romance is really cute, and it's a Beauty and the Beast retelling. So this book is really good in particular, but I have to say I was not a fan of the second book. This book is actually a trilogy, but I wasn't a fan of the second book because I did not like the direction that the series is going in. So I'm kind of just treating this book as a standalone now, and I will keep this on my shelves as a standalone. If any of you have read the Curse of Dark and Lonely series, let me know what you think. And like I'm curious to know what you thought of books 2 and 3. Because I didn't like them, but I'm curious to see what you thought. That's why I'm just treating this as a standalone. So you could read the whole series if you want to, but if you're looking just for like the Beauty and the Beast aspect, just read book 1. This book is amazing. You will not be disappointed. Then these are 2 books that I read like really recently that I just have to throw in there that I loved, and the first book is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. I know this book was really popular recently on Book Talk and BookTube. For me, this completely deserved the hype. I loved this so much. It was like one of my favorite books that I read this year. It was just so good. It was so cozy. I'm really getting into cozy fantasies now. I love that Emily and Wendell are both like in their 30s. Which is really like unique for fantasy. Like I love that they were older and they're both professors, and then they have to like work together to, like, because she's writing like an encyclopedia about fairies, and so they had to like work on a project together, and then they stay in this cozy cottage while she researches fairies, and they like bond and form a friendship, and it's just a really cute book. I feel like if you're like new to fantasy, this would be a great choice. Because it was easy to read. I also love the format and the writing of this book because this book is written as kind of like a diary. Every chapter is kind of like a diary entry, which I found really unique. I loved the writing, I loved the setting, I loved the characters. I loved everything about this basically, so if you're looking for a really cozy fantasy with a cute friendship and you love fairies, you need to read this. I think it's totally worth the hype it's getting. I have not read the second book yet, but I'm going to because this book was just so amazing. And the last book I'm just going to mention because this is a book I literally just finished like last week, and it's now probably my favorite book of 2024 so far. And the book I'm talking about is From Blood and Ash from Jennifer Armentrout. I already mentioned Jennifer Armentrout earlier in this video, so you know I love her, and I love her previous books. But this book was just so good. I was not disappointed. I know this book was hyped up so much, or the series in particular, I think it totally deserved the hype for me. I loved it so much. Like, this is just an amazing romantasy book. I loved Poppy, our female lead. She's such a strong kick-butt character, and I love how she fights, and she's not afraid to fight, and she's great with the sword and a dagger. And I love Hawk, the male love interest. He is amazing. I love him so much, and I love their relationship so much. This book probably has one of the best romances ever. I just love this book so much, and I cannot wait to continue and read the second book. So yeah, I wanted to just briefly mention those as honorable mentions to just show you that I do still read popular fantasies as well. But yeah, that's it for the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know if you've read any of these books or series. I would love to know. Thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you in our next video. Bye!